This chapter is all about employment and unemployment, particularly with regards to India. But before getting into the details of the employment situation in India, there are a number of things we need to discuss in detail first. The very first discussion in this chapter is about who is a worker and what is employment. At this point in the textbook, you should have no doubts about the answer to either of these questions, so I'm going to jump ahead to the discussion of the various types of workers. People who work can be broken down into two mutually exclusive groups: hired workers or self employed workers. Simply said, self employed individuals are those who work for themselves and decide to earn a living without being gainfully employed by a firm. On the other hand, regular workers can be separated into two groups: regular workers and casual workers. Casual workers are those who are not permanently employed and usually engage in tasks which involve a menial level of skill. Moreover, these employees are usually employed on a temporary basis, and as such, they are not guaranteed any sort of employment benefits. On the other end of the spectrum, we have regular employees, those whose employment terms are considered to be permanent and are employees who are entitled to benefits. Benefits which vary by nation but typically include pension benefits, medical benefits, and dental care benefits, to name a few. Since we are in Japan, it is worth mentioning that casual workers in this country can be further subdivided into two groups: contract workers and part time workers. The difference between these two is that contract workers sign an employment contract for a short term, usually 6 months to a year. Part time workers are usually employed without a specific contract duration, but the terms of their employment are limited to only a few hours a week. Another important distinction to make before we continue is to look at the difference between the labor supply and the labor force. The labor supply is defined as a number of man hours of labor available at a given wage. In other words, the labor supply defines how much people are willing to work at a varying level of income. This is probably better explained by the labor supply curve. So if we look at the labor supply curve, we see this unusually shaped graph here on the right side. The explanation of why this is backwards bending is far beyond the scope of this course, but you should realize that as wages rise, people work more, until a point at which time they feel they are rich. Then they realize that their free time also has value. At this point in time, which is marked by L3W3, they realize that although their wages are higher, they value their free time more and start working less because they have enough money to survive and enjoy the things they want in life. This concept is completely different from the labor force, which simply refers to the number of people who are able and willing to work. The next important distinction in this chapter we need to make is between the unemployment rate and the participation rate. The unemployment rate is calculated by dividing the number of unemployed people by the labor force. Just to remind you, the labor force is a total number of people working plus those who are actively looking for work, whereas the participation rate is a labor force divided by the total adult population. Now that we understand the formulas, let's take a closer look at what each of these mean. The unemployment rate tells us what percentage of people want a job but cannot find one, whereas the participation rate tells us what percentage of adults in society are contributing to GDP. As you can clearly see, these two measures are entirely different. In discussions that will occur both later in this book and in the grade 12 course, this is an important distinction you need to understand clearly. Looking at the statistics here on this slide, you notice that the unemployment rate in Japan in July of 2016 was 3%, for India 3.4%, and for the United States 4.4%. However, by looking at the reality of the situation in each of these countries, you can probably give many reasons as to why you might think the Indian unemployment rate is highly misleading. On the other hand, the participation rate in Japan is 60.6%, in the United States 62.7%, and in India 52.5%. The second section of this chapter discusses the size of the workforce. In India, there are 400 million people in the workforce, of which 70% are male, 70% work in rural areas, and female participation in rural areas is slightly higher than it is in urban areas. An interesting point to take note of here is that although 70% of the workforce is employed in the rural sector, its contribution to GDP is less than urban areas. Simply said, rural development is ineffective and inefficient. And the reason why women are working less than men has little to do with skill or education, but rather has much to do with cultural norms which lead to discrimination. Moving on to the participation rate. The participation rate in urban areas is 47.2%, and in rural areas it is 54.7%, with men participating in greater frequency in both urban and rural settings. In addition, the male participation rate for urban and rural areas is 73.8% and 74.7% respectively. These startling statistics should lead you to the straightforward conclusion that many Indians are not engaged in productive endeavors. How do they survive? One of two ways. Either they depend on someone for their survival, like their parents or grandparents or the government, or even on the kindness of strangers, or they are engaged in illegal endeavors. The textbook also mentions that although women work in and around their homes, this work is not measured as gainful employment, and as a result, the female participation rate and employment rate are underestimated. That brings us to the end of this video. In the next video, we'll begin with section 3 of chapter 10.